have a word of prayer? Our Heavenly Father, we thank Thee again for the privilege of being here, for the open heart and the open mind, and for the wonderful possibilities and promises that lie ahead. Amen. This is the last chance I'll have at you. And I want this to be good before going home. So I'm going to talk about perhaps the greatest subject in all the world. The most basic thing pertaining to the prayer life, greater even than faith. I'm going to talk about silence. You know, I'm glad that I was disciplined under silence, although it happened to be in a very negative way. In the early days of my career in penal institution, we had silence forced upon us. We could not speak. We could not speak in the mess hall. We could not speak at our work. And we had to maintain silence in our cells. And this silence was filled with hate. And because they forced us into one of the most powerful mediums in the world, silence, we destroyed ourselves by silence. There isn't anything greater in creation than redemptive silence. The very nature of God is silence. Silence is the undisturbed rhythm of creation. And when it is broken negatively, it always destroys the one who breaks it. Silence is the greatest of all the basic approaches to prayer. There is practically nothing that cannot be done by God through man if he can get still in there. And so there are some wonderful silences and some wonderful bad ones too. And every one of us is going to have to face silence, and facing silence, we're facing God. And if we misuse the silence, we misuse God every time. There are no destroyers. And when it's rightly used, it becomes the great redeemer. I want you to think of some of the negative silences that you have faced and will face, and being forewarned about them, be able to reject them or substitute them for redemptive silences. One of the most common silences is one that falls between a man and his wife when one or the other of them commits the first mental adultery. It's only a thought. It's only an unfaithfulness in the mind, but love is so delicately balanced. It is so tender, so vulnerable, that not even the thought of unfaithfulness can fail to wound it. And when it's wounded, there is a silence that falls between the two. Neither may be able to define it, or to even say what it is, but each one knows that something has entered the wound, love. And the one who has done the wounding knows what it is, and the silence convicts that one. The silence of a wounded love. Then there is the silence that deepens and becomes friction when the unfaithfulness becomes emotional and the response to another is emotional as well as mental. And then when it drifts down into the actual unfaithfulness, then there is nothing left but a miserable silence between the two. The marriage is broken. They may live together the rest of their days, but they'll never be together. You cannot fool the silence. The silence knows. And the silence always convicts. And there is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed to the silence. Silence is the most dangerous and the most blessed thing in creation. I am glad that I learned some of the disciplines of silence the hard way. For when enlightenment did come, the discipline was behind me, and it was not so difficult to maintain the opposite kind of silence. Now, some silences are neither redemptive or unredemptive. My wife and I invited a yogi to come to supper, and we politely asked him if he'd say the blessing. And he said, "Can I say it silently?" And we said yes. And my wife, not being an unusually fine cook, had nevertheless put everything that she had in that little meal. And it was beautiful. I could hardly wait to get to it. It's so exceptional. And it was still warm, and I was hoping that he'd be able to reach the Lord as quickly as possible. And instead of that, he went into nirvana. We sat there an uncomfortably long time, I thought, and I peeked at him, and his head was up, and his eyeballs were rolled up in the top of his head. I was worried, didn't know what to do, didn't want to give offense, and yet I was hungry, and I was in a rather extraordinary situation with such a good meal, and I didn't know what to do. Well, we sat there till the food got cold, and my wife stirred and eased out of the chair and took it back to the stove. I became resentful, and I made up my mind I'm going to fit this fellow out if I sit. If this is going to be a freeze out, I'll be here when he gets out. I don't know how long he was in nirvana, but it must have been an hour. And then he came to, and the food was brought back, and we had quite a companionable time with rather stale food. Now, that silence was neither redemptive nor unredemptive. It just wasn't anything. And so there are neutral silences that get nowhere. And I don't want to discuss that kind. I want to discuss the negative, destructive, and the positive, redemptive silences. Now, you're going to have to face them. You've already faced them. And I want to say that all of your difficulties, especially your personality difficulties, your nerve difficulties, all of your problems that arise out of the friction between you and other people and your environment, that is all done in silence. Have you ever thought about the silence of a great anger countered by the silence of a great cowardice? The two of them coming together. An anger that needs to be expressed, a cowardice that inhibits the expression of it, both thrown back upon you to tear you to pieces in your nervous systems. The silence of young lovers when they quarrel the first time. One going this way, one that. Crying out the night. Maybe several nights. The psychiatrists say that the silence of guilt is behind many, many personality and emotional diseases. Unresolved guilt, held in the silence of a great fear that cannot be shared. I have told you that I don't know whether I have this time or not, but when I was a little boy, my stepmother took me to her church. I was baptized in the Methodist church. She was a Free Methodist. And this minister was a genius, an authority on hell. He had a vivid imagination. And later on in life, I felt that he really wanted everybody to get into that place. That it would have been a pleasure of his to have seen everybody not belonging to his church get into the place he described. I went into the church innocent and I suppose sinless. And I certainly knew Jesus because I had him in my dreams, and he lived with me at night, and I played with him sometimes in the daytime. I also knew angels. I had little angels and played with them. I can remember them yet. I don't think I was very sinful. And he preached a sermon on hell. His method of approach was fear, negative. And he described it as a box canyon without a bottom and a circular wall, and it was filled with brimstone and squirming human beings, and nobody could get out except up, and they couldn't get out by going up because the wall was sheer. I left the place with 3 phobias. One was the fear of being locked in. Another was the fear of death. Another was the fear, you might say, of fear. It was the fear of hearing even about death. And I kept those fears silently. Couldn't share them. They were the type of thing that if you wanted to share them, they would bring up the fear of being ridiculed. And I hold that that is the cause that sent me into a life of crime. For I tried to break the fears unconsciously. My personality tried to break these torments and vexations by facing the thing I feared. I feared death and the dark, so I faced the death and the dark every day and never got rid of the fear. I feared being locked in with no way to escape. He had painted that picture. There's no way out. It wasn't a loving God. He had no loving Redeemer. He had no mercy. There was no way out. And so I faced that, was locked in 14 years of my life, suffering nightmarish torments night after night, living in cold sweat and being unable to share with anybody. Couldn't tell anyone. For out on the surface I was wearing a mask. And that mask was a pretense that told everybody, my pals in crime, that I was a tough character and that I had no fears, that I was fearless. I was putting on a brave front, and I had to maintain that mask while inwardly I was living in that hell that he described all the time. Had to suffer it out in silence, and it was unredemptive. I could not break the spell of this kind of fear planted in my mind at the age of 4. I could not break it by facing it, and it stayed with me until the one who does release us from fear came to my assistance. Now, if you're going to meet a Gethsemane. If you make any spiritual grade at all, you're likely to come in, not only with to one, but a series of minor and major Gethsemanes. If you really get serious enough about this matter of unfolding and releasing your spiritual powers and capacities, you're going to meet up with spiritual crises. And you'll find, strangely enough, that in the crisis, you're always alone. When you're in the Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, there isn't anything anybody can do for you unless it would be to hold your hand. There's nothing to be said. It's a silent matter. And then you are going to learn what it really means to face the silence of God. There isn't anything more terrible than the silence of God. And even Jesus, with the top-ranking spiritual development, the Son of God himself, coming out of his Gethsemane and facing this terrible silence of God, crying out from the depths of his soul, "Oh God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Oh, we're alone. In the great points of our lives, we're alone with God. Everything fades away, just as it did in the life of Jesus. Deserted by everybody. And in one of the Gospels, even the women stood afar off. The disciples had scurried into their caves and hideouts. He was alone. And imagine what that silence of Jesus was when he stood before that Roman governor. Have you ever thought of the silence of Christ standing before Pilate? Have you ever really contemplated those words of Pilate? What is truth? And silence standing before him, refusing to say a word. There was a man in high place. What is truth? And truth standing before him in physical form. And if he couldn't see it, then there was nothing for Jesus to say. Consider all the silent spaces in Jesus' life. Or it said he withdrew and went off into a silent desert place to pray. Redemptive solitude or unredemptive solitude either lifts us up or crushes us down. All destruction takes place in silence, and all redemption takes place in silence. And God is a stillness, a gentle whisper. You have to get awfully still to find it. Now, how about some of these? You know the negative silences that destroy. We face them every day. The list is almost endless. But what about some of the redemptive silences? One of the greatest ones I know is mourning. When we lose something we love, we mourn. And we're silent. A father and mother had one boy. This is a recent, not over a year old. And that boy was bright in school. His grades, he just stood out. He seemed to have wonderful character, great possibilities. But out around Los Angeles and Pasadena and in that area, there is a tremendous temptation always presented to you to experiment with narcotics. And so many of them fall. They had raised this boy up, had given him every advantage, and were intending to continue to give him every advantage. And then a lassitude came over him. Strange moods were revealed. His grades in high school just went down. A terrifying disinterest came over him, and they couldn't understand it. They wanted him to go to their minister. He wouldn't go to church anymore. They mentioned going to a psychiatrist, and he blew up, had a fit of anger. And they couldn't imagine what it was, and they confided in a detective, and he went home with them and faced the boy. He said, "Son, roll up your sleeve." And the boy refused. The detective said, "Roll up your sleeve, or we'll take you down to headquarters and roll it up for you." And he rolled it up, and his arms were full of punctures. They had lost their boy. The mother mourned. The father rebelled. He went into a fit of anger, and even when they got to our home, he was still in this rebellious anger. And we had a hard time dealing with him. The mother was just silent. She just mourned. He said, "We've given him everything. There isn't anything that he has been denied that would help him. And this is his way of showing gratitude for the home that he's had. What good is he now? He's gone." And then he made a terrible statement. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, he ought to be shot." terrified. The mother now was mourning double. This father's attitude and frightful anger increased the weight of her mourning. And that morning, sitting there right beside me, communicated to me, this is power. This silence here is the power, this morning. And I began with that father, a Christian man, that is, a church member. And I began with him, and I began to talk about Jesus. How would Jesus look upon your son? Would he say he ought to be shot? Would he say he's hopeless? He's no good? Would he say that he's ruined his body, he's killed his spirit, he's blotted out his soul? Would Jesus say that? Would Jesus accuse him of being a hopeless, incurable sinner to be damned and cast into hell forever? No. Jesus would say, love him and get lots of prayer behind him. If necessary, hang yourself upon a cross vicariously for him. He is worth being saved. And before they left, we got that father in the notion of, at least half-heartedly, of trying to resolve the matter in prayer. And even in the half-hearted way that he was able to do it, when the case came up to court, the judge looked at the boy, who was just hating his father and rebelling against him as the father was against the boy, had been refusing to cooperate in any way, didn't care what happened to him. That was his attitude. But prayer had changed him. He stood before the judge. And the judge said, we don't want to send you to prison, although you have been in a ring of drug users who have been stealing to get the money to supply your habit. We'd like to get a hold of those at the top and send them. And he said, I am willing, if your parents are willing, to turn you over into their custody if they will finance rehabilitation in that center in Kentucky. And they said they would. And they sent him there, and he was there 6 months in the withdrawal. And he did withdraw completely out of his system. Back home now, a better boy than he was before he got into this trouble. He can appreciate now what it means to be free. That mother had power. She mourned. She had great love. And when you lose the thing you love, you mourn. And blessed are those who mourn, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now you can mourn unredemptively, and that is where spiritual discrimination comes in. Whatever you do, don't get into the silence of mourning and do it unredemptively. Do it redemptively. I was in a home in South Carolina, the grandfather and the grandmother, and the father and mother of a boy, a child, the only one, and he had been killed in an automobile accident. Someone got me to go there to see if I could help them to pull up the blinds. This was 6 months after the accident. There were five boys in the car, hit the abutment of the bridge, and he was the only one killed. And then they went into mourning. And it was unredemptive mourning because the grandparents accused the parents of letting him go out in the first place. It seems as though the grandparents had objected to him going out with these boys, and the parents let him go out. And so now the grandparents were accusing them, blaming them, and they were resenting it, and all four of them were living in this house with the shades down, and nobody talking to anyone else. Just hating each other and resenting, and living there in that terrible silence. And when I went in there, it was almost like walking into a death house. I stayed there all day and talked with them, reasoned with them, talked about the boy. I told them probably he was better off where he was now. He was in the kingdom of heaven. How did they know that if he had remained here, what might have happened to him? Talked with him all day. Then they raised the blinds, and we got into prayer, got them into prayer, got them down on their knees forgiving each other, and we had dinner together. And they wanted me to stay overnight, but I couldn't do it. They were mourning, but it was unredemptive because they had let a negative influence come in there, hate, accusation. Keep it redemptive. My father mourned. He mourned for me. The last picture I have of Father is standing with his arms through the bars of a county jail. He had loved me and mourned for 25 black, bleak, and dreary years, praying and mourning. Every prayer he ever said was disappointed. Every hope that he had ever sent up to God had been wounded by insult and injury. He mourned. I was lost, and he mourned. And I see him standing there. He had come to the prison to get me that last time. I rode away with him on the train going home. And he told me about my mother, whom I never knew. Her light had gone out when mine came in. He told me what a beautiful woman she was and about her keen spiritual sensitivity. And how she had talked with him before she went, and the deathbed promise that he made. She had wanted him to give me every chance that he could, and he'd promised he would. She had felt that there was a destiny in her sacrifice, and she died in that belief. He told me about it. And he had come to receive me and take me home, and on the way he said when I was young in my teens, he said I was called to the altar in a revival meeting in the Methodist Church, and I was converted. And during that conversion experience at the altar, he said I had a very definite call to turn my life over to God and to be about his business in his ministry. And he said I didn't do it. I rejected the call, and I've never had a happy day in my life. I've never been happy. Then he said, I somehow feel that my rejection of that call has had something to do with your trouble. And I don't feel worthy that you should make any effort to make good for my sake. But I want you to make good this time, son, for your mother's sake. And the only response I had was thoughts of the next crime flowing through my mind. I was not long in committing it and not long in getting caught. Between the time that Father learned of it and the time he appeared at the jail to see me, he had aged 10 years. His shoulders were crushed. You've seen shoulders that look broken. His chest was caved in. And he stood there, holding my hands, inarticulate, unable to speak a single word. Just stood there with his head down, holding my hands, and I saw crucifixion before me. His face was a mask of suffering. It's as vividly etched upon my memory today as anything is there. I can see it wherever I look, that face. Oftentimes I wish I could escape from that face, like the hound of heaven. His eyes were glazed with pain. And he was on the cross. He stood before me and died on his feet. And it was not long after until actually he did die. There was silence. The climax of many years of mourning, coming to a climax of crucifixion, when I had administered the last blow that his great stout heart could take. When that news reached him, that was the knockout blow. But there was not a word. And I know in his silence there was no criticism. There was no judgment. There was no condemnation. There was only love in human form stretched on the out-reaching arms of love. Cross. And I believe that crucifixion had something to do with my deliverance just a few months later. The silence of mourning, the silence of a great loss, years of mourning, coming to this point. That's redemptive silence. I have no fear of where Father is. I have no doubt as to where he went when he left this place. None whatever. For he had mourned, he had loved, and he had continued to love through thick and thin, and had put love to the supreme test. And love had never failed. It was not long after that I was in a silent place. One of the most horribly silent places you can get in. A punishment cell in a penal institution. Dark, silent, alone, miserable. And it was into that place and into that silence that the Redeemer came. And strangely enough, he spoke no word. He only came and stood above me, the wreck of one who had violated every law, moral, physical, and spiritual, on earth. And he had no condemnation. There was no criticism. There was no explanation that the law of life is cause and effect, cause and consequence. That the law is whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. You disobeyed that law. You've made your bed. Now lie in it. Nothing like that. Not a word. He stood above me as silently as Father stood before me, and simply looked down upon me and drew my eyes up to him and siphoned the hate out of me, just as though you would siphon water right up through a hose. He pulled it right up out of me, right through my eyes, and the only thing I could see were his eyes. Endless, indescribable, infinite, unimaginable compassion. And in that silence, he set me free. My fears were gone. They were dissolved as though they had never been. And for the first time since I was 4 years old, being freed from those fears, I experienced peace and joy. And so great was the joy that I was doubtful as to whether I even wanted to get out of that place. If getting out of there meant that I was going to be cut off from this experience, I would have been perfectly willing to close it right there and leave this place. For there is nothing that is comparable in the experience of man on this planet and to know that peace which passeth all understanding. And that comes when we are completely and totally released from any possibility of anxiety or fear anymore. Perfect love casts out fear. I had faced the fears and failed. And what the society had been trying to do for a quarter of a century through punishment and every other means, love did in a moment, and did it silently. No sermon was needed. No words were needed. There is no power like silence. You just can't. And if you learn how to enter into your closet and close the door, shut out the distractions of the world, get your mind fixed in Christ, where it is stayed in him, where no thoughts are wandering anymore, where none of the negative evil influences of the world can get in, where your nerve ends are quiet, the tensions have gone out of your body and out of your mind. In that closet, relaxed, free, at peace, with the silence of God, who is in secret and who silently and secretly listens, and in silence and secret rewards you openly. If you can get that, you've got the basis for powerful praying. I think that's one of Jesus' greatest secrets. You're going to have to deal with silence. Everything that's created and everything that's destroyed is done in silence. Everything that grows, grows in silence. Everything that's built is built in silence. Even this breezeway came out of the silence of some architect's mind. Every bit of progress on this earth, material progress, industrial progress, all the development, has emerged from silence. Silent reaches of creative brains. Silence is power. Louise mentioned the wires up in the rafters. They're silent. They come down the walls. They're secret and silent. And they have ends coming out here in plugs. And the power is there. You can't see it. You can't. It's up there hidden. And you have all kinds of things whereby to manifest that terrific power. But you have to discriminate. You have to have judgment. And if you want heat, you have to plug in your heater. You don't plug in your refrigerator when you want to iron your clothes. You plug in the iron. And if you want sermons or lectures or music, you plug in your radio. If you want pictures, you plug in your television. If you want light, you turn on the light. But it's all from the same power. And it's coming down from those hidden secret lines up there in the attic and behind the walls. And God is up there secret. And we enter into the closet. And if we know what we want and why we want it when we enter that closet, you can be certain that He will reward you openly. I came out of prison, I wanted friends, first of all. And I discovered that secret of going into the secret closet and in perfect silence listening, getting still, tuning in with the silent God. And then specifically asking and knowing why I ask. If you want friends, pray for them, and you'll get them. The way I pray for those I want to meet, I pray for them to be used of God. I don't pray to meet them. I pray that He use them to the fullest possible capacity. And by we meet. I wanted to meet Brother Tom. Here, we meet. And we meet in the right way. Nothing awkward, nothing strange. It's easy. Come together for prayer. That's the way it should be. I am reminded of Thoreau, and you would hardly say that he was an Orthodox Christian. But he knew the power of silence. And he went up there at Walden Pond and built a shack and lived a life of secrecy and silence up there. And when it was all over, and he came out of that silence, he had a contagion that reached around the world. He came out and he expressed in two thin little volumes, two little essays, something that of his findings that had come out of the stillness. And one of those fell into the hands of a Russian profligate, a brilliant novelist, one of the greatest artists in the world at that time, but one who lived a dissolute life. Leo Tolstoy. I noticed a book of his back there. And that essay of Thoreau's influenced Tolstoy and turned him to God. And when Tolstoy turned to God, he turned to the Sermon on the Mount to find out about the constitution of the heavenly world and to discover the necessary disciplines bound up in that constitution. And he wrote about it. And the thing he wrote fell into the hands of a little dark man down in Africa, a man who had been educated for the legal profession in England. And from Thoreau down through Tolstoy down to Gandhi came this contagious thing emerging out of silence up here in Massachusetts on Walden Pond. Non-resistance. Resist nothing. Overcome evil with good. Non-resistance. And it came right down. Civil disobedience. Be obedient to God and go to jail if that obedience to God conflicts with the demands of obedience by unregenerate society. And it traveled right down the line. And the time will come in Russia when communism has run its course, that Leo Tolstoy will be looked upon as the patron saint of that country. And Gandhi had coming down this influence right down across the years, silently reaching that little Hindu. And he, sitting cross-legged with his orange juice and goat's milk and a diaper on, practicing civil disobedience and nonviolence, and stayed with it for 20 years. And a vegetarian, even worse than that. I doubt if he ate very many vegetables except the ones George Washington Carver sent him, soybeans. And sitting there with his goat's milk and orange juice and God pouring through, the gigantic and world-girdling British Empire, eating meat and drinking whiskey, fell like a ripe plum right in his lap. No bloodshed, no war, no violence. He set India free in silence, without violence. That is the power of silence. And when you put prayer in that silence, there is just no limit to what it can do. And we heard about that this afternoon, and it's true, and it's going to sweep. I wasn't in Washington, but I would have given anything to have heard Billy Graham tell that story of what he faced in Great Britain when he went over there on his mission. They intended to crucify him right there. A battery of cynical, sardonic newspaper men had lined up on the front seats, and all the time he was speaking, they were laughing and talking back and forth to each other. But before he went out there, he had fallen to his knees in prayer. And when he gave the final prayer, that vast throng of people packed into that auditorium, including all these newspaper men, fell into a Sabbath lull. Dead silence. And the papers were kindly. And before he got through with that mission in England, they were all for him. Everybody. That came out of prayer. And prayer can do the same thing, sweeping this country like leaven, leavening our churches and just flowing. Prayer teams, prayer cells, prayer groups everywhere. People learning to pray, people praying. People knowing how to discipline their lives to the silence of God and listening. Tremendous power. I'm thinking about that man in the Second World War was an anti-Nazi, an Austrian. And the Nazis were after him. He had fought them with his pen, a vigorous writer. But he was an atheist, and religion was the opiate of the people, just the same in his way of thinking as in the way of the Russians' thinking. But he was a great writer and had great influence in politics. And then the Nazis came in, and of course he was against them, and they got after him quickly enough. And they chased him across Europe and finally cornered him in France, and there was no way out. He was in the vicinity of that Catholic shrine of Lourdes. And in his crisis and in his predicament, he prayed an agnostic's prayer, but he prayed it from the depths of his heart with integrity. Oh God, if there is a God, and if that God can help me now, and my wife too, and we can somehow or other escape from this impossible trap. All that I am now or ever will be in the future, all my energy, all my talent, everything, will be thrown into the business of God. And a miracle happened. And they were transported out of that trap and got to this country. And on the way over, he had already begun to fulfill the beginning part of his bargain. He began to write. And by the time he got over here, he had the first draft of a great book out. Sitting alone, facing God, listening, putting down God's thoughts, working it into a great pattern, a mosaic of art, something that could be read widely. And he finished it on this side, and it became an instant bestseller. I think something like 350,000 copies were sold before it began to fade. Then it was made into a great motion picture. And I imagine some of you have seen it. It was called The Song of Bernadetta. A great book and a great picture. And Franz Werfel became God-centered. And he had a great influence on another man, an atheistic, agnostic American magazine editor on Liberty magazine for years. Came to his crisis. Life was empty, everything and nothing, finding his way into an empty church in New York and on his knees in silence, finding Christ. And then writing two great books that have swept the earth. The greatest story ever told, the greatest life ever lived. Gone around the world. Been on radio, on television, on the screen. The silence of God. When men get silent, God's silence speaks. And when it speaks, it's contagious. Now we're going home. And you are going to realize that this mountaintop experience up here is not down there in the valley. And you're going to run into opposition. And in between these oppositions are going to be silent spaces. Now, you can fill those silent spaces with rebellion. You can fill them with negative reactions against persons, against life. You can fill them with hatreds. You can fill them with self-pity, self-commiseration, or any other negative force. And it will destroy you. But if you will take the Sermon on the Mount seriously and fill those silent spaces with redemption, you will find that these very experiences that come to you that otherwise would seem hard and difficult will work together for good. And you will find the answer to it in the Sermon on the Mount. If anybody despitefully uses you, pray for him. If anybody feels that he wants to become your enemy, love him.